It goes without saying that an epic superboss encounter can help to enrich video gaming experiences by providing challenges that require players to go above and beyond. Within the previous episode of our exploration, we deconstructed every superboss that appeared within the original Final Fantasy all the way up to Final Fantasy IX. Some interesting traits were identified. It showed that superbosses are often aligned with lore, have similar ability sets, and even have a weird association with summons. And it's for that reason, if you're coming fresh, we'd recommend checking out episode 1 via the link in the description below so you get up to speed and understand some of the connections we're going to be making in part 2. But with that in mind, let's continue our exploration into the complete evolution of superbosses in our typical granular style. By the time Final Fantasy ventured onto the PlayStation 2, superbosses had become solidified as part of the expected challenge offered by the core experience. But even though that would be the case, Final Fantasy X ended up adopting a similar approach to Final Fantasy VII. When Final Fantasy X launched in Japan and North America, there were 3 enemies that could be considered superbosses, the first of which was Ultima Weapon. With many of the core creative team working on Final Fantasy X also having worked on Final Fantasy VII and VIII, Ultima Weapon served as a clear allusion to the past, and alongside its role as a weaker superboss being retained, its design was also similar. Omega Weapon then served as its bigger sibling, just like it did in Final Fantasy VIII. But there was a key distinction here, as within the Japanese and North American releases of Final Fantasy X, Omega Weapon only featured a moderate increase in HP. The challenge therefore came from how aggressive Omega Weapon was in comparison to Ultima Weapon, and abilities that were shared between the two, such as Shimmering Rain and Core Energy, dealt much more damage when delivered by Omega Weapon. It also had access to some abilities that Ultima Weapon did not, and 2 of them, Demi and Ultima, referenced Omega Weapon's previous ability set in Final Fantasy VIII. Nova then appeared as an ultimate ability, and it could deal heavy damage to all party members. Both of these encounters could be found within an optional dungeon called the Omega Ruins, and there was no prerequisite for facing each superboss outside of natural progression. There would, however, be some lore associated with the pair that denoted them as being ancient beings. A significant period of time passed between the first calm, which was brought about by Yunalesca's defeat of Sin, and the next. During this time, citizens started to become skeptical about the merits of Yevon's teachings, and one such individual, known as Omega, rebelled against the organization. When the rebellion failed, Omega was executed for treason. Due to dying an unclean death, Omega could not ascend to the far plane and became an unsent. But due to how much anger was held inside, Omega the Fiend grew in power, and such was the gravity of this power that Omega, who over time transformed into Omega Weapon, willed Ultima Weapon into existence. It was a sorry tale, but it helps to place these 2 superbosses into the lore of the world, and this was similar to the relationship the likes of Omega and Shinryu and Ozma had to their own respective worlds. The third superboss in this game was then called Nemesis. It would feature the exact same design as both Omega Weapon and Ultima Weapon, and it served as the true superboss in the original release of Final Fantasy X. Whereas the other 2 superbosses could be found within an optional dungeon, to square off against Nemesis, players needed to complete a quest. This quest was associated with an old man who ran the monster arena, and it involved first capturing 10 of every fiend in the game, and second, defeating all of the unique monsters that had been created as the quest progressed. Once these 2 prerequisites were completed, the old man created Nemesis, and it could then be challenged. Nemesis featured 10 times more HP than Omega Weapon and had maximum offensive stats. It would also use an upgraded variant of Nova called Armageddon, and this dealt 99,999 damage to all party members. And the intriguing note here is that Kimahri could learn Nova from both Omega Weapon and Nemesis, and this resurfaced an interesting trait, as although it was somewhat infrequent, blue magic spells could also be learnt from other superbosses, including Omega and Ruby Weapon. After the release of Final Fantasy X in Japan and North America, the development team started work on a re-release for the Japanese market that would also be used as the basis for its release in Europe and Australia. This new release, dubbed Final Fantasy X International in Japan, incorporated balancing adjustments and bug fixes made for the North American release, but it also added a whole host of additional content, including, but not limited to, the Expert Mode Sphere Grid and 9 brand new super bosses. Ultima and Omega Weapon were also enhanced, with the latter in particular being notable in this regard, as Omega Weapon was granted the same HP as Nemesis and the ability to absorb many major elements. 8 of the new super bosses fell into one category, and they were collectively known as the Dark Aeons. These fearsome super bosses were enhanced versions of the same Aeons that could be called forth by Yuna and many of the other summoners found throughout Spira. Each Dark Aeon could be found throughout the world, and they started to appear after the party escaped from Bavel. Just like in Final Fantasy VII, this meant a story event served as the trigger, but they would not all appear at the same time, and they all exhibited different behaviours. Dark Valfor and Dark Shiva, for example, blocked entry to prominent locations, with the player needing to defeat them in order to regain access. The Dark Mega Sisters would relentlessly chase the party after they came within their proximity, and Dark Anima, which needed player input to spawn, remained passive until challenged. The other very intriguing element here was, of course, the connection with summons. From Final Fantasy VI through 9, almost every super boss had some kind of connection with the game's most powerful summon. In Final Fantasy X, the Dark Aeons served as the very embodiment of that trait. As they were the game's most powerful summons, the player just couldn't summon them. Via the Dark Mega Sisters, another trait resurfaced. In Final Fantasy VIII and 9, certain super bosses such as Omega Weapon and Ozma could be made easier. In the case of Omega Weapon, this was through manipulating the leveling system, and with Ozma, it was accomplished by completing a side quest. In Final Fantasy X International, the method was a bit more clandestine. Instead of being treated as one entity, the Dark Mega Sisters were treated as 3. This in itself was a new trait, as there had never been a super boss encounter before that required the player to face multiple enemies at the same time. But that didn't have to be the case. As mentioned, when the Dark Mega Sisters were encountered, they gave chase, and the fight initiated if they succeeded in their chase. However, should the player run towards the valley and stay ahead of the sisters, they would begin to separate. Dark Cindy would be the first to give up the chase, meaning the player could split the fight into 2 separate encounters, one against Dark Sandy and Dark Mindy, and one against Dark Cindy. But it could also be split into 3 encounters, and this then gave the player a severe advantage. The loose parallel here was with Deathgaze from Final Fantasy VI, as the player would be able to heal up between encounters. Adopting this approach also prohibited the Dark Mega Sisters from using their devastating Delta attack. Should every Dark Aeon be defeated, a new super boss would then unlock called Penance. This method of unlocking was almost identical to the method of unlocking Nemesis, and as Penance was accessible via the world map, it also harkened back to Final Fantasy VI and VII. Penance served as by far the strongest boss in Final Fantasy X International, having 2 million more HP than Nemesis and higher defensive stats. Because of this, it would almost be a necessity to use the game's ultimate weapons, the Celestial Weapons, as they ignored defense. The next major challenge was simply surviving. Penance would be accompanied by 2 arms, similar to Ruby Weapon, who was accompanied by 2 tentacles. They would each take independent actions, and similar to the fight against Ruby Weapon, they could be rejuvenated, and their status influenced the abilities that Penance could then use. For example, Penance would only be able to use Judgment Day, its ultimate attack, should both of its arms be active. The left arm of Penance could also use Terra Graviton to deal numerous status effects, including Doom, a subtle nod back to previous super bosses who could also deal out death-inducing status effects. There were 2 major differences, however. Almost every prior super boss had a set script that determined actions taken. Some of these were reactive depending on the boss's current state, or if they were attacked by certain moves or abilities. But the core script remained consistent throughout. Penance differed in that there were 2 distinct phases. The other major difference came via Yojimbo. It wasn't common, but some superbosses in the past had an Achilles heel, so to speak, and the Iron Giant in Final Fantasy II springs to mind here. But Penance, for all its bravado and challenge, could be made into one of the easiest superbosses in the franchise, as it was not made immune to Yojimbo's Zanmato. Therefore, if enough money was delivered to Yojimbo, Penance could be defeated in an instant. Final Fantasy Tactics Advance featured 3 superbosses, and just like the original Final Fantasy Tactics, they were associated with side quests. After completing all 300 of the core missions, new side quests would unlock, and 3 of them, Immunity Pass, Favoritism, and Decision Time, would require the player to best 3 very tough foes who were known in-game as the Corrupt Judges. The first 2 missions would see the player square off against a single, very strong judge, who would be supported by a small group of allies. Each judge had an intriguing name, with the first named Judge Mike and the second named Judge Reinhold, perhaps as a reference to 2 very famous North American actors called Mike Judge and Judge Reinhold. These encounters were conceptually similar to Final Fantasy Tactics, as Elidibus was also supported by allies, but the parallel will be furthered by the party being supported by an ally for the quest line. In Tactics, this was Byblos, and in Tactics Advance, this was Judge Magister Cid. The third encounter was also against multiple foes, but this time it was 3 judges who were unnamed. Based on the number of opponents with similar power, this had shades of the encounter against the Dark Magus Sisters, but the difficulty would be much less extreme. Final Fantasy X-2 followed the same pattern, having 3 core superbosses. Each inherited traits from the past, but there was also room for some significant expansion. And in this regard, the best place to start is with Angra Mainyu. What separated Angra Mainyu out from prior superbosses was the way in which it could be encountered. After the Albed started excavating the Cactuar Nation, Angra Mainyu was woken from its long slumber, something that denoted it as an ancient being. At this point, Angra Mainyu could be encountered when doing random excavations. But even though the party could go on the offensive, it was not possible to defeat the superboss at this point. In most cases, Angra Mainyu would just eject the party from the battle using its unnatural selection ability, and this served as a loose nod back to Ruby Weapon, who could also remove single party members. The true encounter against Angra Mainyu would take place in Chapter 5. With the superboss being contained for so long, there was a fear that it would retaliate against the Cactuars who had imprisoned it. The Gullwings embarked on a quest to protect the Cactuars, but their success saw Angra Mainyu turn its attentions to the Albed instead. This meant Angra Mainyu would have to be faced head-on, and it would be joined by 2 allies called Tarwitch and Zarich. Amongst its array of abilities was one called Perdition's Flame. What made this ability quite brutal was that it attacked 10 times, and each attack would deal just under 20% of a character's HP. There was no direct connection, but it did serve a similar function to Terror Break, an ability used by Omega Weapon in Final Fantasy VIII, that also struck the party more than 10 times for a hefty portion of damage. The other 2 superbosses could be found inside Final Fantasy X-2's optional dungeon called Via Infinito. Ever since Final Fantasy V, superbosses have been created that had some kind of connection. In that particular game, Omega and Shinryu were connected by lore, but superbosses in Final Fantasy VIII and X also had connections, and in the case of the latter example, one superboss even spawned the other. In Final Fantasy II, that trait resurfaced via Trema and Paragon. Both of these superbosses were unsent individuals, and they had an intimate relationship. Trema had served as the founder of New Yevon, and having remained unsent for so long, he had gained incredible power, even able to bend powerful fiends to his will. That then connected Trema with Paragon. Similar to Omega in Final Fantasy X, Paragon was created from the warped and twisted memory of an unsent individual. In this case, it was Lord Zion, who served as the original guardian to Lady Yunalesca. And it was perhaps because of this connection that Paragon used a similar model to Nemesis, which in turn was connected with Omega and Ultima Weapon. What made these fights unique though, and emphasized the connection, was that they were fought back to back. As soon as the encounter with Paragon had concluded, the player was forced to square off against Trema with no chance to even heal in between. Something like this had never happened before in relation to superbosses, And it added an extra strategic dimension, as players needed to manage their health throughout the Paragon fight so they didn't start off on the back foot against Trema. In terms of the encounters themselves, one of the more intriguing aspects was that Paragon used an ability called Final Impact. This would deliver 14 strikes against the party with a damage equal to 1/8 of their maximum HP and MP. And this was similar to both Perdition's Flame, a move used by Angra Mainyu, but also Omega Weapon's Terror Break in Final Fantasy VIII. When Final Fantasy XI launched in 2002, a lot of effort was placed around building solid foundations. And outside of core mechanics such as party dynamics, leveling and jobs, one of the most important mechanics was the introduction of what became known as notorious monsters. Unlike standard enemies found in the field, or those related to either main scenario or optional quests, notorious monsters were planned to be very tough and very rare. For this reason, the earliest iterations had high amounts of HP relative to regular bosses, and only spawned in the world once every 24 hours. The first notorious monsters were added to Final Fantasy XI during the beta on the 16th of January 2002, and they had affectionate names such as Slobbering Sue and Skewer Sam. But even though they were tough, and often had link shells competing for their spoils, none of these initial entrants, or indeed none of the notorious monsters associated with the initial launch of Final Fantasy XI, were often considered as superbosses. That definition would not be used until the launch of the game's first expansion, Rise of the Zilart, and the most accessible superbosses, known as the Archangels, were available through an optional branch of the main scenario quest. As the Rise of the Zilart questline reached its conclusion, players were required to make their way to Ruan Gardens. Here, they would need to square off against enemies known as the Archangels, who were dark manifestations of the player character races. In the traditional sense, each of these rather difficult enemies was meant to be faced one after another by a full party of 6, and they could be encountered in any order. But those who were up for the challenge could take on an alternate version of the quest called Divine Might. Instead of facing each boss back to back, this would see all 5 Archangels encountered at the exact same time, and this served as a much more extreme version of what could happen when facing the Dark Mega Sisters in Final Fantasy X International. What made this option so perilous was that each race adopted a classic job and sub-job combination, and they could take full advantage of the toolkits, including the use of what at the time were known as 2-hour abilities. And some of them, such as the Hume Archangel, could even use their 2-hour ability whenever they wanted. In the worst case scenario, this meant numerous Archangels could use their 2-hour abilities at the exact same time. And as some of them could even summon pets, this meant the fight could get rather complicated, as numerous enemies would need to be juggled. And to make matters worse, as this was an optional quest as opposed to a mission, deaths also resulted in experience loss. Everyone would therefore need to be well organised in order to manage the various scenarios that could occur. But the reward was worth it, not least because unlike the standard quest variant, Divine Might could be tackled by an alliance of 18 people. In the traditional quest, those 18 people would need to split off into 3 separate parties of 6, and each party would need to undertake 5 encounters. This then created a net total of 15 separate encounters. But by taking on Divine Might and pooling resources together, those 18 people could complete the quest with just 1 encounter. Another superboss called Kirin was added as part of a much larger patch that was launched on the 16th of December 2003. Kirin was classified as a notorious monster, and it could be found in the area affectionately known as Sky. But its relative strength was much higher than many of its peers. Players also had to undertake numerous steps before even having the chance to square off against Kirin, and this harkened back to some earlier superbosses. Perhaps the most notable part was that many other difficult bosses needed to be defeated as a precursor. Alongside Kirin, Byaku, Suzaku, Cerberus, and Genbu, and they were each classified as notorious monsters in their own right. Defeating them in their individual standalone encounters would grant a seal, and those seals would need to be traded at a forced spawn point in the Shrine of Ravitao at the same time for Kirin to appear. The fight itself had some intriguing traits. Final Fantasy X and X-2 had established connections between superbosses, with one entity having ownership or even control over another. Kirin took this notion further, as within 2 to 3 minutes of the encounter having been initiated, it would start to summon allies, and those allies would be the 4 notorious monsters that needed to be defeated in order to obtain the seals, albeit with slightly less health than their original forms. This meant, in the worst case scenario, players would end up fighting against Kirin and a combination of other notorious monsters all at the same time. And this then meant that back when Kirin was added to the game, a full alliance of 18 people and an ironclad strategy was necessary for success. Should that be the case, then players would have their pick of some rather valuable spoils, but they would also be granted the Kirin Captivator title. The final superboss worth talking about as part of this expansion was the Dynamis Lord. Dynamis was added to Final Fantasy XI in February 2004 as the first major piece of repeatable endgame content, and they proposed a whole new gameplay arc that revolved around players being taken to an alternate realm. The prize was the fabled relic weapons, which at the time were pretty incredible, but to gain access to even one would take a considerable team effort. In April of that year, Dynamis was then expanded with 2 new zones added, and the most important here was Dynamis Zarkabard, as the Dynamis Lord could be found within. As the premise of Dynamis was to create an alternate version of existing locations, the Dynamis Lord was a reimagining of the Shadow Lord, the main antagonist from the original main scenario quest who was based in Zarkabard. But outside of the visual style, there were limited similarities. The Dynamis Lord was accompanied by 2 dragons called Yin and Yang. They would be independent, but also have an intimate connection, perishing the moment players defeated the Dynamis Lord. And this was then similar to other previous superbosses, such as Angra Mainyu. Due to how and where the Dynamis Lord appeared, it was a serious step up in terms of challenge, but the rewards were worth it, as some of them were very rare items required in the relic weapon upgrading process. Much like Final Fantasy VII and X, Final Fantasy X-2 also received an international version, and amongst all of the gameplay tweaks and additional content was a brand new superboss called Almighty Shinra. 2 of the major additions to Final Fantasy X-2 International were the Creature Creator and the Fiend Arena. Whereas one allowed for the recruiting of various enemies and NPCs into the player party, the other granted the opportunity for players to test themselves against challenging scenarios. As this developed, more and more intriguing enemies could be fought against and recruited, but from a lore perspective, the Creature Creator existed so that Shinra could learn more about fiends. This insatiable thirst for knowledge then impacted Shinra in an unexpected way. After exploring the histories of Ultima and Omega Weapon, Omega Weapon's Fireflies were absorbed by Shinra and he transformed into Almighty Shinra. From a lore perspective, nothing like this had ever happened before. Quite often, superbosses had roots in ancient history, and that was kind of the case here, but never before had a superboss been formed through the fusing of 2 separate entities, except perhaps Final Fantasy Tactics, where Elidibus called forth the power of Serpentarius. To fight against Almighty Shinra, a quite exhaustive list of requirements had to be met. The final step involved completing the Fiend's Tale for Omega Weapon, which resulted in the Fiend World Cup being transformed into the Almighty Shinra Cup. The fight itself was quite devilish, with Almighty Shinra able to use a handful of harsh abilities, and one of them, Final Impact, was inherited from Trema. But Almighty Shinra also had access to another ability called Cleone that had similar mechanics, also able to strike random characters many times. After completing the encounter, the party would then gain access to the Last Resort Garment Grid. Final Fantasy II International also featured another boss called Major Numerus. It too was connected with the Creature Creator, but there were additional factors at play. For one, a version of Major Numerus was fought at the conclusion of Last Mission, the expansion that came packed in with X-2 International. But this would serve as a mere tease for what awaited players should they wish to complete the Fiend Arena. After defeating Almighty Shinra, a new competition was unlocked called the Farplane Cup. This again fulfilled the requirement of one superboss being needed to be defeated before another could then be encountered. The Farplane Cup featured a combination of very tough foes including Seymour Guado, Orin, and Paragon. Major Numerus was then positioned as the toughest possible enemy players could face, but it only started appearing after winning the competition 3 times. And even then, due to the power of Trema, Major Numerus would sometimes lose that duel. If it won, however, players could be granted the chance to square off against this fearsome foe. and what made Major Numerus such a challenge was that it was composed of 4 sentient parts. This was similar to previous superbosses such as Ruby Weapon, but each of the parts had much more utility, and across them they had access to a plethora of high-powered abilities. Unum and Duo, for example, had a focus on buffs and debuffs, able to use Protect, Confusion and Dispel. But there was also another interesting throwback to many earlier superbosses, as Unum could use White Wind, a variant of the quintessential blue magic spell. Tria and Quattuor then focused more on offensive spells, with Tria focusing on elementals and Quattuor using many ultimate versions. Each part would also have access to a unique command, which could deal high-tier damage, sometimes even ignoring defense. Major Numerus therefore stands as the ultimate test for those who are looking to challenge their knowledge of the Final Fantasy X-2 combat system. Even though the original Final Fantasy had an allusion to the superboss trope via Warmech, they did not become an official part of the Final Fantasy DNA until Final Fantasy V. But as Square started to explore re-releasing their older games onto more modern systems, the developers thought about how they could tease old players back. On the one hand, this was achieved by enhancing almost every aspect of presentation and making tweaks and modifications to existing gameplay mechanics and the story. But on the other hand, it was achieved by the creation of new content, such as items and equipment, and new challenges, which in the Dawn of Souls version came in the form of new dungeons and of course, the introduction of superbosses. 3 specific superbosses were created, and they each served as a humble allusion to where the notion of superbosses began. In the Lifespring Grotto, this saw Shinryu and Omega appear, and they both retained their Final Fantasy V sprites as well as their fundamental traits. It saw Shinryu again have high attack and low physical defense, with Omega featuring the opposite attributes, and they would each retain many of their famed abilities such as Tidal Wave and Wave Cannon. True to form, there would be much debate about which encounter posed the greater challenge, but one of them would need to be defeated in order to complete the Lifespring Grotto. Final Fantasy VI did not feature a true superboss, but Deathgaze did fill the void, and its appearance in this version of the original Final Fantasy, as well as its status as being weaker than both Shinryu and Omega, cements this notion. However, Deathgaze would still pose a challenge to unprepared parties due to its high attack rates and relentless use of instant death abilities. As Final Fantasy II was also included in the Dawn of Souls package, a similar approach was taken to building out the game and creating additional content. And in this regard, most of the focus was placed around the Soul of Rebirth questline. At its conclusion, players would square off against an alternate and more difficult version of the Emperor. But as this was a mandatory encounter, it does not fulfill the superboss criteria. There was, however, a challenging optional encounter that was included, and just like the superbosses that featured in the reworked Dawn of Souls version of the original Final Fantasy, it paid reference back to a previous superboss. Ultima Weapon could be found in the secret Chamber of the Seal, where it guarded the Ultima Tome, and it was notorious for having high HP, but also hitting like a truck through a variety of physical attacks, but also maximum level flare magic. Chains of Promathia launched as the second expansion of Final Fantasy XI in September of 2004, and it represented the next evolution of the game. It also represented an important milestone as it marked the release of Final Fantasy XI in Europe. It meant expectations were high, and with regard to challenge, the Chains of Promathia main scenario quest provided that in spades. But as the developers were looking to enhance the experience, they sought to create a devilish, high notorious monster that would put the rise of the Zilart incarnations to shame. This high notorious monster would then serve as Chain of Promathia's resident superboss, and it was called Absolute Virtue. Found within the Lumoria region, Absolute Virtue is one of 7 notorious monsters inserted into the game as part of a patch released in April 2005. The others were presented as jailers, each named after a respective virtue, and they were all interconnected, built to work towards a clear objective, creating the ultimate challenge for players of Final Fantasy XI. Similar to Kirin, jailers would need to be defeated in order to gain the item required to spawn Absolute Virtue. But there was now much more of a puzzle when compared to previous superbosses. For example, the 4th, 5th and 6th virtues had to be obtained from the Jailer of Justice, the Jailer of Hope, and the Jailer of Prudence, and they would be needed to spawn the Jailer of Love. Only after the defeat of the Jailer of Love would Absolute Virtue then be faced. And this then created an intriguing parallel with Final Fantasy X-2, as the fight was sequential, and this mirrored the relationship between Paragon and Trema. Squaring off against Absolute Virtue was brutal at the time, and compared to every previous super boss in the history of the franchise, it ended up being quite unique in this regard. Super bosses had always been designed to be challenging, rewarding players for coming up with creative strategies to plot their demise. Absolute Virtue differed in that the developers were quite strict with regards to how they wanted Absolute Virtue to be defeated, and any victories that did not adhere to this strategy were deemed inappropriate and voided. This voiding came via Square Enix themselves, as patches were issued time and time again to render successful strategies ineffective. There was until 2011, some 6.5 years after Absolute Virtue had been added into the game, when the level cap was increased from 75 to 99, and the game became much easier due to an increase in relative strength for each individual party member. As of right now, it means Absolute Virtue is still challenging, but it's nowhere near the alpha super boss it was when it was first introduced all the way back in 2005. Final Fantasy IV followed the same trend as the Dawn of Souls releases of Final Fantasy I and II, as the developers sought to introduce new challenges for returning fans. But this time, the two super bosses they introduced were not mere homages to the past, and they could both be found inside the Lunar Ruins, a new dungeon that unlocked following the defeat of Zeromus. As part of this dungeon, each character would need to face a specific challenge, and at the end of each challenge was a tough boss encounter. This then mirrored Final Fantasy X International, as the tough boss encounter manifested through enhanced espers that had the Lunar moniker. But the true challenge of the Lunar Ruins was not these individual boss encounters. Instead, it came via the final trial, as players would need to defeat Zeromus EG. Similar to the Lunar Espers, and indeed the Dark Aeons, Zeromus EG represented an evolved form of Zeromus. But the main point of difference here was that whereas the other examples had similar sprites and models, Zeromus EG had a very different visual style. However, that wasn't the case for all players of Final Fantasy IV, as the default sprite for Zeromus was changed within the Easy Type version, and this was the version that was used for Zeromus EG. The fight itself would be challenging, but similar to Final Fantasy IX, where Ozma could be weakened by certain actions being taken, Zeromus EG could also be weakened. This was possible via the grimoires, items that were obtained after completing individual trials. If they were still accessible to the party when they fought against Zeromus EG, some of these grimoires could be used to turn the tide of the battle in pretty significant ways. For example, Grimoire LD, obtained by defeating the Lunar Dragon, would inflict the Toad status on the superboss. Even still, the fight would pose a challenge due to some harsh abilities. Big Bang, for example, returned and was now much stronger. And although this was expected, due to it being an iconic move of Zeromus, the odd association here was that Paragon from X-2 also used Big Bang. The other super boss featured in the Lunar Ruins was a monstrous dragon called Brachioraidos. It could be found near the bottom of the ruins, and it posed a rather different challenge to Zeromus EG. Perhaps the most unique aspect was that the fight against Brachioraidos was quite dynamic, in that it would have distinct phases, adapting to the strategies deployed by the party. Each phase would have a preference for either physical or magical damage, with its final phase placing more emphasis on frustrating enfeebling magic, including Slow, Toad, Confuse, and Berserk. This emphasis on phases was then kind of similar to Penance. Upon defeating Brachioraidos, players would find themselves in possession of the Hero Shield, by far the best shield in the game, as it granted significant defensive boosts compared to the Crystal Shield. Dirge of Cerberus was the next game to feature a super boss, but even though it broke from convention by tackling a brand new genre of game, numerous traits were still present. Similar to Final Fantasy Tactics Advance, once the main story had been completed, extra missions would unlock. There were over 40 in total, and the final mission, dubbed Stronghold Impervious, represented the game's toughest test, not least because it concluded with an encounter against Chaos itself. From a design perspective, the setup here was then similar to Final Fantasy Tactics, Midnight Steep contained numerous optional levels of increasing difficulty, and the toughest test would appear in the form of a superboss housed within the final level. The major difference here, however, was that the superboss was thematically unlike anything seen before. Quite often there was an association with some kind of ancient species or long-lost technology, and the appearance of the superboss was therefore justified as the power upset the current status quo. Here, however, the antagonist was a mirror of the worst manifestation of Vincent Valentine himself, an unbridled version of chaos. This did technically still fulfill the objective of being an ancient species, as chaos was created long ago by the planet as a counterbalance and assistant to a mega weapon, but the manifestation fought against was based on Vincent himself. What then made the encounter all the more difficult was that the level, as an entire collective entity, was incredibly harsh. Regular enemies had beefed up strength, and the Sviets would need to be faced in unconventional settings throughout. These elements would then need to be navigated even before chaos could be faced. Now, due to the nature of the game, the encounter could end up being quite short in comparison to the typical turn-based super bosses, but even when facing chaos with a maximum strength Vincent Valentine, the risks were still clear. That then brings us onto a related property, Before Crisis Final Fantasy VII. Even though this game launched in September 2004, it wouldn't be until May 2006, after the release of Dirge's Cerberus, that the game would gain its superboss, dubbed Jade Weapon. With the main story concluding a month prior, the final major update to the game included Weapon Mode, and this saw the player Turk travelling around the planet as they attempted to find Jade Weapon. This then mirrored the original Final Fantasy, where the two superbosses were also weapons, and they were added after the game's initial launch. It also meant the connection with ancient beings was retained. However, the intriguing point here is that according to the chronology of Final Fantasy VII, Jade Weapon was the first weapon to appear, as it was awakened before the others in response to the threat of Zirconade. To encounter Jade Weapon, players would need to embark on a quest that would see them hunt the mysterious being. This then created a loose parallel to Deathgaze in Final Fantasy VI, as players needed to hunt around the world for Jade Weapon, squaring off against it numerous times. But this time, it was a lot more explicit and far more laborious. Perhaps the most intriguing aspect was that the location of the encounter could change. Due to Before Crisis being a mobile game, the player's physical location in Japan would denote the in-game location that the fight would take place, with Tokyo, for example, being associated with Midgar, and Hokkaido being associated with Icicle Inn. This then highlighted how much the concept of superbosses had evolved, as even though only 5 years had passed between the release of Nemesis in Final Fantasy X and Jade Weapon in Before Crisis, the volume and uniqueness of superbosses had only continued to expand. In the initial sense, this saw a huge increase in the volume of superbosses, with Final Fantasy X taking this to extreme lengths. But with the advent of new genres, such as the MMO and the third-person shooter, developers were keen, wherever possible, to explore how they could make their superbosses more challenging and devilish than those that had come before. Within the next episode, which will start with Final Fantasy XII, we'll see which trends continued to evolve and which then faded away, while also exploring any new traits that were introduced as a way of ensuring the concept continued to stay fresh. So, be sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell to make sure you are immediately informed when the next part is published. And be sure to let us know in the comments which has been your favourite superboss out of the ones we've covered in this particular part. Alright everyone, with that, this is Daryl signing out. As always, I'd like to give a big thank you to all of our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters, especially Benjamin Snow, The Livestream, Gregory, Justin Dent and Sukun TDK, who are super special Onion Knight supporters, and of course, a big thank you to everyone for watching this video. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.